Well, greetings, friends, and welcome to another edition of the Danielle Smith Show. I am Danielle Smith, and thank you so much for tuning in. I've noticed that there is a real difference between doing podcasting on this forum versus doing podcasting without video. First of all, I have to get my hair and makeup done, and I already know that someone's going to complain that there's no makeup department. I can already see I'm not done enough eye makeup today. But more importantly, I want to be able to walk through my newsletters on Monday because I met a wonderful lady when I was doing the Sean Newman's Presents show in Lloydminster a couple of weeks ago. And she said that she didn't normally have time to read through it all in one go, but while she was doing her gardening or housework, she would prefer for me to be able to read off what I had written. Now, I'm not going to read it word for word, but I think I will walk you through what I do on Sundays in case you haven't signed up for it. Danielle at Danielle Smith. Oh, sorry, no, that's my Gmail. daniellesmith.ca, and then you can just go into the sign up section and you can sign up for my newsletter, and you'll get that on a weekly basis as well. But what I often like to do is just start off with an email that I received, and Amanda, bless her heart, she's been writing to me for some time. She sent me an email that I thought was one that the reason I wanted to share it is that a few of you have said the same thing to me, is that you think that talking about things like cryptocurrency is too inaccessible, too hard for people to understand, and we should just shut up about it. And in fact, one of the things that she said is that she had a friend who noticed that Pierre Polyev was talking about this, and she said, "Let me see if I can read this to you here." She said she thanked me for the primers that I did last week, and said I was just chatting with a friend who said that Polyev needs to tone it down on that cryptocurrency because he is losing people like her because it's not well understood. So let me say a couple of things. One of the things I've noticed about conservatives, and we do this all the time, is that we seem to approach a political candidate with the idea that I need to agree with them 100% on all things. And if I find the one thing that I disagree with them on, then I'm going to reject their candidacy altogether. They've lost me. If you're not 100% in alignment, then you don't have my support. We seem to want to look for reasons not to support somebody. And this is important because I've noticed that on the left, they do the opposite. If you're a progressive candidate, you say, well, I may hate 99% of the things you stand for, but I found that one thing we can agree on. Therefore, because we can agree on that one thing, I'm going to vote for you. This is a reason why their strategic voting always works and why the conservative movement always busts apart. We always try to find our differences in the conservative movement where they put a lot of water in their wine in the progressive movement. And so as a result, they always win. So nobody should say that they're losing support for Pierre because they don't understand this issue very well. He's talking about it. It's alienating to you, and therefore you're going to look for another candidate. To me, sorry, it just doesn't make sense. So the other thing that I'd say is that one of the things that is probably confusing for people is that Pierre has said very clearly that he is opposed to central bank digital currencies, but he's in favor of cryptocurrency. And for people who didn't watch my shows last week, that is going to sound like Greek to them. But I wanted to tell you the state that the world is in for him to be making these kinds of statements, because one of the things that we need to be aware of is that we are on the cusp of what Time magazine said is the biggest change to the money way, how we use money, biggest change to money since the end of the gold standard. And we can't stop this from happening. This is, I guess, the part about it is that it would be lovely if we could all just freeze the moment in time that was our favorite moment in time. I wrote in my newsletter this weekend, my favorite moment in time probably was somewhere around 2005, because I got all the benefit of all the great technologies we had. I had my BlackBerry and I was pleased with that. I think I had my BlackBerry in 2005. It was the very first phone that I got. I preferred the BlackBerry format with the digital, with the raised keyboard. So I could live in a world pre-iPhone. I could live in a world pre-technology getting really creepy. I know some of you might even go back a little bit further. My husband, for instance, he's a train guy, and he'd probably go back to an era where we were still doing passenger train traffic in Canada. So somewhere around the 1950s. He also likes men who were, he likes the style of men wearing hats. I think that's sort of the Mad Men era. So if we could freeze the moment in time, that was the time that we wish we could stay in, I'm sure we would all choose a different era. But time keeps on marching along. And part of what I've noticed about technology is that with it marching along the way it has been, that it's moving faster and faster, and it's becoming a bit disorienting for us to keep up, and it's becoming a little bit creepy. So I think we just need to be prepared to walk through some of these creepy issues, because it's going to have a huge impact on us. And it's already well underway, which is why what I maybe didn't explain to you last week. And so I wanted to give you sort of the state of where we are at, because the Americans have, I think, with their most recent moves, the first one, when they used their power to exclude Iran from the international payment system called SWIFT, and now more recently excluding Russia from the international payment system called SWIFT, it's accelerated this change away from the U.S. currency and what's going to take its place. I've been trying to figure that out. Now I think we've got a pretty good look at what that's going to look like. But I wanted to start off by showing you this this overlay, why people are so afraid of digital currencies. When I was on the air before, I talked to you quite a bit about China's social credit system, and I thought that this image gave a pretty good idea of how it works. I think we all have an idea of how credit scores work, because with credit scores, I get mine each week from Borrowell. It tells me, I think it's out of 900, but this one is out of 1,000. China's social credit system expands the idea of a standard credit check to all aspects of life. Each citizen is assigned 1,000 points, constantly monitored to judge their behavior and rated accordingly. So you can see on the left-hand side that if you've got, you get certain rewards. If you are helping the poor, for instance, that raises your score. If you're praising the government on social media, that raises your score. If you're engaging in charity work or donating blood, those are the ways in which your score will go up. Your score will go down. Punishments: if you spread rumors on the internet, if you have insincere apologies for crimes committed, if you're cheating in online games, so they monitor that too, and if you're not visiting your aging parents regularly. Isn't that something? So you've got, Laura, if you can move that China social credit score off the screen for a second, so I can just see the fast right. Oh, hold on, let me try this one more time. Oh, I can't seem to get rid of it and doing it at the same time. No, if you move those words off the screen, so I can just show people what the reward. Thank you. Just little technical things. So the rewards you'd have include fast tracking a work promotion. So if your score is higher, then you will get promoted at work. You will get priority status for your children's school admissions if you want to get into a particular type of school. If you'll get easier access to bank loans and consumer credit, and you will get tax breaks. So they've linked your behavior to your credit score, and those are the ways in which you benefit. Now, on the punishment side, you'd be excluded from booking flights or train tickets. You'd be ineligible for certain jobs. You'd be restricted access to public services, and you'd have public shaming on TV and social media. So that is the world that they've moved into in China. At least they're pioneering it. And so there is no question that people are terrified of what the Chinese social credit score applied to our jurisdiction might look like. Now, the reason I wanted to start there is that you need to know how far along China is in this concept. There was an article in Time magazine last year that it was about August, where they talked about how advanced some of the jurisdictions around the world are in developing a central bank digital currency. In China, it's called the renminbi. They followed the Bahamas by about 6 months. So Bahamas was the first to roll out a digital currency. China followed 6 months later, and they showcased it during the Beijing Olympics. They wanted it to be in place. So when it was first written about last August, it was something around 20 million users. By January of this year, there were already 260 million users, and there were billions of dollars worth of transactions, which is interesting, isn't it? Because even though they have the means to do digital payment with other types of programs, there's private programs you can use called Alipay and WeChat. Those are the most common ones. In fact, they're so common in China that 96% of people already use a digital payment system. And it's a lot more advanced than ours as well. The Time magazine article goes through this story about somebody taking their phone and having a QR code, and they just have to flash their QR code, and they can buy things at the convenience store, pay for their commuter rail tickets, or they can buy lunch at the cafeteria just by flashing their QR code. So China has already moved to that step. Now you've got the digital currency from the central bank coming in, this renminbi, and remarkably, 260 million people already within the space of a year have adopted it. So it sounds to me like, and this is what I suspect would happen in Canada as well, is that if we switched over to a central bank digital currency and made it voluntary, people would adopt it as well. It's just we are rule following people. And so, and we've observed that over the last 2 years, that if government says, hey, do this, it's good, then it's going to be good. So I suspect, the reason I suspect this is happening is there's just so many advantages to governments in trying to adopt a system like this. And let me walk through with you some of those advantages. So the biggest advantage that they would have, and let me try to deal with the positives first, so that you're not completely freaked out. I'll tell you one more thing that will make you completely freaked out. The World Economic Forum, yes, those guys, they did a paper back in November of 2021 talking about digital currencies. Actually, it was 233-page document, pretty serious, and it has a whole range of people who are experts in the field talking about the advantages of it. So when you have all of the largest bankers and the largest countries collaborating and talking about how to make this occur, it feels to me like we're just heading in this direction. So you've got a couple of pioneers, and here's a couple of things that they have discovered would be the advantage to it. So number one, if we want to look at the positives, as I said, the one of the main things that you can do is that you could, and I've actually heard our government talking about this as well in Alberta, is figuring out a way to instantly transfer homes and property. We've got a real problem at land titles where it takes 60 days once a sale of a home has been complete to get it registered at land titles. If you have this instantaneous way of transferring a token, so I sell my house to you, it transfers over to you instantaneously, and there's a record of it that's public, it's audited, there's no middleman. That's one of the advantages that they talk about, being able to use these kinds of digital currencies. You could also use a fractional share of any asset. So instead of having to own like a full vacation property, you could have a token that gives you access to a portion of it. So it's a way of making a timeshare and other collectibles more accessible. Things like, if you want to own, some people own their wealth in art or in wine. You could own a fractional portion of those types of collectibles. That would be another thing that you could do with this kind of tokenization and digital currency. You could do more easily cross-border transactions in the financial industry. I mean, right now, you have all these limitations about how much money you're able to transfer cross-border. I think it's only $10,000. If you have the ability to track it from one currency or one jurisdiction to another, and have that verify and be able to verify that and audit it, it can make those transactions occur more quickly. It will make the SWIFT banking system obsolete, because why would you need to use the SWIFT banking system and have your transactions mediated by the American currency, which happens with a lot of contracts around the world, particularly oil and gas, when you can do this instant validation and the instant conversion. So that's another thing. It makes the SWIFT banking system obsolete, which I think why China and Russia and the other countries in the so-called BRICS partnership are interested in it. And also, I mean, here's another positive is that we have 1.7 billion people in the world who currently don't have access to bank accounts. This would allow them to have essentially a bank account on their phone, and they would be able to have currency on their phone. So it enfranchises 1.7 billion people in the world to make it easier for them to pay. So those are some of the reasons, if we're going to be generous about why government wants to do it. But of course, there's a dark side to the approach with a central bank digital currency in particular. So when the Chinese first implemented it, they did it as a pilot project. And one of their missions at the time was to get people spending money because the authorities wanted to drive consumption because they were suffering the same problem everybody else was, that we saw a decline in consumer spending. So when they first implemented it, they put an expiration date on the dollars because they wanted to make sure people went out and spent them. So when have you ever heard of a central bank being able to do that? They also have the ability, because you can have that program into the currency, you can customize the currency so it can be spent on some things and not others. So the examples they gave in the article is that if they were trying to stimulate the hospitality industry in a certain area, they'd allow the coins to be used for eating out, but not used for other things. The other example as well, and this is where I think the biggest concern is, we've already seen how the social credit score would work, is that it could immediately allow for the government to fine the citizens for behaviors deemed undesirable. So imagine, just as a for instance, you end up getting pulled over because you are speeding or you've run a stop sign. You could have your account automatically debited for that infraction. That's the other part the government's kind of like. And then, of course, the ones that we're most concerned about is that dissidents and activists could see their wallets emptied or taken offline. And that is, I don't know the extent to which that is currently happening in China. Like anything with China, you never know when you're reading about them if they're being on the up and up. So I don't know if that's occurring, but that's the fear that people have. So this is the reason why Pierre Poilievre was taking a pretty strong position. He said he'd look into seeing if there's a way to make it illegal. I have a suspicion that because we're not going to see an election until 2025, that's 3 years from now, I have a suspicion that they are going to be well along the pathway of having adopted this. In fact, the articles seem to suggest that there's some sense of urgency that maybe a fifth of the world central banks, and you can believe that the Western world's going to be at the forefront on this, could be on a central bank digital currency within the next 3 years. So I would fully expect that Canada would be one of them. And so what is that going to potentially mean? And the other thing I wanted to just point out, because as you know, I think people are mixing up the two things in their minds. The type of central bank digital currency I described and all of the powers it gives to government are very different than what Bitcoin is. And there was an article in the National Telegraph, I linked to it in my newsletter, that I think describes this really well. And I want to read this to you so that you can think about the two types of digitization in a different way. There's a real difference between, I'm going to use these terms now too, a central bank digital currency versus a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. And what the National Telegraph says to describe this is Bitcoin as a currency, it functions almost like an anti-central bank digital coin in a lot of ways. So if one is, think of it as poison, the other is the antidote, where central bank currencies are completely controlled by a central authority. Bitcoin is 100% decentralized. No one controls the system. Central bank currencies have built-in controls so that they can be they can discriminate on against people based on age or sex or wealth or race or whatever categories the government wanted. Bitcoin, on the other hand, has no built-in control. So this kind of discrimination is impossible. Central bank currency transactions can be tracked. That's what you guys are worried about. But in Bitcoin, the transactions can be done peer to peer, and they're untraceable. Central bank currencies continue to be the potential for windfall for bankers, who, as we've seen, love to print money and drive up inflation. But Bitcoin is a deflationary asset and can be mined. The amount that can be mined decreases over time, less and less every 4 years. So Bitcoin, this is the reason why I know, and again, I know this is hard to for people to wrap their head around, but if this is going to be the biggest change in money that we have seen in 50 years, I think we need to be aware of what the options are and the impact it's going to have on us, because not having the American dollar as the central point of currency is going to change how our geopolitics work. At the moment, and this goes back to the deal that was made in the 1970s when we had the energy crisis, is the world agreed that we would sell oil and gas and it would be denominated in the American dollar. So we've essentially had what is called a petrodollar. This is part of the I think some of the division that we've seen in Canada as well over the last number of decades, is that anytime oil and gas spikes, it also causes the value of our dollar to spike. And when our dollar spikes, it impacts our friends in Eastern Canada who have to buy more imports because they're a manufacturing base. So if we're going to be switching to a different type of system, what is it going to be based on? Now, we already have a bit of an idea, but when we look at what is happening in Russia. So there's an article called on the website called Algora, and they're a bit of a publishing clearinghouse. They seem a bit on the lefty side. I was trying to look at them because I've never heard of them before. They wrote a really good article that was posted on my locals page, and I wanted to tell you how things are developing in Russia and with the alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS partners, so that you can see what the counteraction is going to be. So according to them, what Russia did initially is that they convinced their partners after Russia got excluded from the SWIFT system. I think we all heard that they initially said that they are going to sell their products denominated in rubles backed by gold. But what happened is they convinced their BRICS partners to stop trading in dollars and to eventually create a common virtual currency for their exchanges. Until they proceed with this, the currency, until then, they're going to proceed in gold, but the currency is going to be based. So think this through. How do you get 5 different countries with 5 different economic levels of strength, 5 different populations, 5 different bases of support, 5 different trading profiles? How do you get them to operate with a single currency? That's a real challenge, right? So here's the way they're going to do it: is the currency is going to be based on a basket of BRICS currencies, weighted according to the GDP of each member state, and based on a basket of commodities on the stock exchange. And so their commentary is that this system should be much more stable than the current one. So we've already got Bahamas moving to a digital currency. You've got China moving to a central bank digital currency. Now you've got Russia, who, because of the actions of the last couple of months, they're brought it on themselves, but this is their reaction to being excluded from the banking system. They said, fine, we're going to create our own system. So think about that. When you look at the biggest population bases in the world, they don't have the biggest economies yet because they're still emerging economies in a lot of ways. But if you've got China and India and Russia, Brazil, and South Africa all collaborating on this currency. Brazil, presumably, as the largest nation within South America, that would bring many of their trading partners into the orbit of this new currency. And South Africa, with the strongest economy in Africa, that would bring their trading partners into the orbit of this partnership. And then also the Asian countries as well. So we're looking at a world potentially where 90% of the world population falls under one currency. So what are we going to do in response? It just seems obvious to me that the pathway we would follow would be that each of our countries, Canada, Europe, the UK, Australia, the United States, and any other partners who want to join us, would also set up their own individual central bank currencies, and then they would do the same thing that the BRICS partners are, which they would collaborate on developing a central currency that could very easily be transmitted between the nations within the partnership. And then presumably, if globalization is going to continue, our trading bloc and their trading bloc, we'd have sort of two international currencies competing with each other and two international currencies that would be interchanged. So that, I think, is the way the direction the world's going. And it's going to be happening very, very quickly because, as we've seen, we have been racing with the money printing machine in all jurisdictions, and we're seeing the huge impact of that. So in this past March, inflation was 6.7%. That is the highest level of inflation that we have seen in 30 years. Now, those of you will be old enough to remember what happened last time around. So in the 1970s, what occurred is that as inflation went up, interest rates kept going up and up. I remember my dad maxing out with, I think it was something ridiculous, like a 21% mortgage rate. And so if for those of you who've lived through that, that seems to me one of the pathways that we could go down is that the government will just continue to try to raise rates to arrest the increase in inflation. I mean, I don't know what our inflation rate is this year, but if it's already 6.7% in 1 month, then presumably we're looking at an annualized rate of 15% or higher. I'm not entirely sure, but this is why we're in a bit of a bind. Most people, because we've had stable currency now for so long, they want cash. But if you hold cash outside of any kind of interest-bearing vehicle for a longer than a year or two or more in this environment, it's going to be worth less and less. Inflation is just going to eat into the value of it. And so people are going to be drawn, especially if there's a new central bank digital currency that is endorsed by the government of Canada, people are going to be drawn to that. So I think that's the environment that we find ourselves in. But we still have this real problem of what are we going to do about inflation and government debt? What are we going to do about private debt? There was a really good article, and that was written by Lynn Alden, who's got an economic background quite clearly, and she wrote about the concept of a debt jubilee. That's what I was often wondering when you heard the term Great Reset. I wondered, are they talking about resetting the situation we find ourselves in with excessive debt? Maybe, because that used to be very common. So Alden goes through and looks at the history of debt jubilees. And the way they began was about 4,000 years ago. They began because farmers would go through and they would borrow to get all of their inputs, and then harvest would take place. And if it was a terrible harvest, they would not be able to pay their lenders, and their lenders would come along and back in the day put them into debt servitude, literally. So they would go into slavery, or their property would be seized. And if the rulers of the day allowed this to continue for too long, you'd end up with all the money in the hands of the bankers, and they would have slaves working the land for them, and that's unstable for society. You'd end up with popular uprisings, and we've seen more than a few beheadings over the years. So politicians and leaders get very nervous when they start seeing too much income inequality, too much imbalance. But this is where we're heading. I mean, as bad as we have public debt, and it's horrendous, we also have a terrible private debt problem too. And so what are they going to do to solve that? Because if we're all heavily indebted, we're in a world of inflation. The traditional model has been to just increase interest rates. You increase interest rates and you're potentially driving people into a point where they're going to go into bankruptcy. They're not going to be able to pay their bills. This is the nature of the problem that I think the leaders are grappling with on how to resolve it. So why can't we just do a debt jubilee now? It's a very complicated way as much as it's difficult to describe the new money system that we want to move to, or they want to move to, it's pretty difficult to describe how our current money system works. Because I think most of us have a conception that somewhere in a bank, there's gold bars, and they have a certain amount of currency related to those gold bars, and then they hold back a certain amount of money so that if you come and take your deposit out, you're going to be able to have the money there. And that's not quite how it works. So Alden has this. She talks about it being a circular system that we find ourselves in. Uh, it's an Ouroboros. Have you seen that with the snake eating its own tail? That's how she describes our current money system. Central banks, or commercial banks, store their cash at the central bank, which are assets for the commercial bank and liabilities for the central bank. And then what happens is the central bank holds government debt as its primary collateral, and government debt is backed by the government's ability to tax its citizens. So in practice, by having a central bank create new bank reserves, you just buy the government debt when it's needed. Because everything is interconnected this way, essentially our value of our currency and our bank deposits are based on how much money the government borrows. I know, weird. Then you can't remove one part of the system, otherwise it collapses it all. So how do you solve this problem? So she's got a couple of interesting thoughts. None of them are good for you and me. One thing that she says they can do is that they could take a certain portion of government debt and convert it to a bond with 100-year zero coupon rate. So basically allow themselves to borrow for 100 years at zero rate of interest, and then that would allow the interest rates to rise again. So wouldn't you like that deal? Being able to borrow for 100 years at zero interest? Sorry, not available to you, just available to government, because the interest rates are going to have to go up to a more reasonable level. I've been thinking about this for some time, because if you look at the long-term mortgage rates that some of the folks who were buying homes in the 50s and 60s used to have, I was talking to a friend last night who said that his dad had essentially a perpetual mortgage, long as period of time as he wanted, at 6.4%. So keep that number in mind, because that is probably the interest rate, the long-term interest rate that's normal. When it comes down really a lot lower than that, is because governments are manipulating the rates to make you borrow more. And then it succeeds so well, puts so much gas on the fire, that then they overcompensate by going on the other side and raising rates to such a high level, so that it causes bankruptcy. So that's the seesaw that we find ourselves in. So one way to solve it, they give themselves a long-term rate at 0% interest, so that it's still officially on their books, but then they allow for rates to go up, so you and I end up having to pay more. The second thing she said they could do is continue to hold rates low, and this may be one of the things that they would have to do, and let inflation rates burn the debt away. I think this was part of what happened in the 1940s, she goes back and says. And so you continue to keep the low rates so that you don't end up defaulting on your house mortgage. But then when you go out and try to buy food and energy and anything related to that, your purchasing power is eroded. So you're not able to buy as many things. The third thing you can do, I don't say this because I want to see this happen, but we have seen it happen, which is what happened in Cyprus in 2013 when they got into a banking crisis. What they did is they did what is called a bank bail-in. And I remember we've actually changed the legislation in Alberta or in Canada to allow this too. Essentially, if you had $100,000 sitting in cash in the bank account, they would just take about 10% of it and then issue you share certificates for the bank. They called it a bail-in order to get enough actual cash flow in the bank as well, so that they didn't end up with failing. So I've been wondering, though, if the switch to a central bank digital currency is a fourth pathway for government to generate more revenue. A few years ago, Elizabeth May talked about a financial transactions tax, and the Democrats in the US have been talking about it too. They started talking about it just in the transfer of stocks and bonds and other financial assets for a couple reasons, on the assumption that those who are trading in those types of investments have a higher level of income. It would tax the rich, which is part of that milieu. But they also said ostensibly it was to stop the day trading that was occurring and to slow down some of those transactions. But what if the real reason why the central banks want to have a digital currency is because then they could start charging the kind of financial transaction fees that the banks are charging directly? Like every time you do an e-transfer, how much do you pay? buck 50, right? Unless you've got a good plan that has that included. But if you even look at the cryptocurrencies, they've got a 0.5% transaction rate when you sell one between another. If you look at Visa, MasterCard, you don't see it, but the merchant loses up to 3.4% on every transaction that takes place. So what if that's what's going on here? I did a little bit of calculation because initially they thought that just by charging this 0.2% rate on financial transactions on stocks and bond sales, they figured in America they'd be able to generate $77 billion over 10 years. Or sorry, $777 billion over 10 years. Since we're about 10% of the population, we could assume that Canada would be able to generate $77 billion over 10 years. But if you broaden this concept out so that every single transaction that was in Canadian currency carried some kind of hidden financial transaction service fee that went to government, then you would be able to generate a huge amount of money. We've got $1.7 trillion of GDP, so $1.7 trillion of transactions. There's a little bit of a fee that is factored in there at, call it 0.5%. That would generate about $8.5 billion per year. If it went as high as the Visa transaction fee of 3.4%, now you're talking $58 billion per year is real money. So I think that this might be at the heart of what we're turning to, is that we're making this shift from being a world economy based on oil and gas transactions and our dollar value hinged to that. That was a shift again from the previous world, where the world transactions were based on a hinge value of gold. This new world that we're entering into is a world economy based on digital currency, digital cash flows, digital transactions, which are, when you think about it, the highest value that we have in our economy right now. Look at how much our tech companies have escalated in value. Look at what is going to happen in future with companies like Amazon and Elon Musk's company and various other digital companies. I think what has happened is that the powers that be, not only do we have a debt problem that needs to be solved for the public debt, a private debt problem that needs to be solved, an inflation problem that needs to be solved, a currency problem that needs to be solved, a geopolitical problem that needs to be solved, and also the increasingly surveillance system monitoring of citizens' behavior that government wants to do. This central bank digital currency offers a solution for all of that. So I just want to lay that out. I'm not going to keep on talking about this. I know I told you that last week, but I needed you to understand how far along all of these measures currently are, because you can't now, I don't think there's a bit of a freight train coming. And as a result of these changes that are occurring all around us, we have to figure out how we're going to respond. So this is the reason why politicians like Pierre Poilievre is talking about an alternative to what we're seeing happening in China, and what we're seeing the World Economic Forum pushing, and what we're seeing our own central bankers doing some analysis on, is that they want to move to a controlled central bank currency. The only way you'll be able to keep your digital transactions private is through a different decentralized currency means that's not controlled by a central bank. And as for how the globalization works in this new world, I mean, some people think that we're now in an era where globalization's at an end, where all of the countries in the Western Alliance are going to trade with each other, and all the countries in the BRICS Alliance are going to trade with each other. So we're on the cusp of some really major changes, and I just wanted to make sure that you had all of the facts and figures at your disposal so that you could do your own research on it. Please do that. If you want to check out my newsletter, I do post them in the archives online. You can go to daniellesmith.ca to check it out. I have all the links to the things that I talked about. I was a little bit nervous showing any links today because they're a little bit tricky on social media. They get a bit stingy about what you're allowed to show and whatnot. So I'm still trying to figure those rules out. But thanks so much for tuning in tonight, and we'll do this again on Wednesday. Talk soon.